David pulled into the driveway of his new house for the very first time as the official owner. The keys felt heavy in his pocket, and he couldn't stop smiling. After years of saving every penny and working overtime at his tech job, he finally had his own place. Not just any place either. A beautiful 2-story home in Oakwood Heights, one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. The house was everything he'd dreamed of. White picket fence, manicured lawn, and a charming front porch, where he could already picture himself drinking morning coffee. The moving truck was scheduled to arrive in 2 hours, and David wanted to walk around his new neighborhood to get familiar with the area. He locked his car and started strolling down the sidewalk. The neighborhood was exactly what he'd hoped for when he signed the mortgage papers. Every house looked well-maintained, the lawns were perfectly trimmed, and expensive cars sat in every driveway. Children's bikes were scattered on some front yards, and he could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. David had grown up in a much rougher part of town, where broken streetlights and abandoned lots were normal. His mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment, and she'd always told him that education was his ticket to a better life. Now, at 32, he was living proof that her advice had been right. As he walked past the 3rd house, on his street, he noticed an older woman standing in her front yard watering some rose bushes. She was probably in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive-looking clothes. When she saw him approaching, she turned off her hose and walked toward the sidewalk. "Well, hello there," she said with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't think we've met. Are you visiting someone in the neighborhood?" David smiled back and extended his hand. "Actually, I just bought the house at 247. I'm David. Nice to meet you." The woman's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, how wonderful. I'm Linda. I live right here at 245, so we're neighbors." She shook his hand, but her grip was weak and brief. "I have to say, I'm surprised. The house sold so quickly and we didn't even see any showings." "I worked with a realtor who showed it to me privately," David explained. "I knew it was the one as soon as I walked in." Linda nodded slowly, her eyes scanning David from head to toe in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Well, welcome to Oakwood Heights. I hope you'll find our little community very accommodating." Something in her tone made David pause, but he pushed the feeling aside. Maybe she was just being cautious about new neighbors. That was probably normal in a nice area like this. "I'm sure I will," he said. "It seems like a great place to call home." "Oh, it absolutely is," Linda replied, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "We work very hard to maintain certain standards here. In fact, I'm on the Homeowners Association board, and I make sure everyone understands the importance of keeping our neighborhood looking its best." She walked over to her front porch and returned with a thick blue binder. "These are our community guidelines. I like to give them to all new residents personally. It's so important that everyone understands the rules from day one." David accepted the binder, surprised by its weight. It had to be at least 50 pages. "Wow, this is comprehensive. I did review the HOA documents before buying, but I appreciate having another copy." Linda's eyes lit up. "Oh, wonderful. So many new residents don't bother reading them at all. They just assume they can do whatever they want." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Just last year we had someone try to paint their front door red. Can you imagine? Red, in a neighborhood like this?" David glanced around at the other houses, noticing that most of the front doors were indeed neutral colors, white, black, or various shades of brown. "I see. Well, I'm planning to keep everything pretty standard anyway." "That's smart," Linda said, nodding approvingly. "The guidelines cover everything: paint colors, landscaping, mailboxes, holiday decorations, parking rules, even the type of outdoor furniture you're allowed to have." As if on cue, a postal truck turned onto their street. David watched as the mail carrier stopped at each house, placing letters and packages in the various mailboxes lining the road. "Speaking of mailboxes," Linda said, following his gaze, "I noticed the previous owners took theirs with them. That's actually against the rules. Mailboxes are supposed to stay with the property. But don't worry, I'm sure you'll find something appropriate." David looked at his empty mailbox post, which stood at the end of his driveway like a lonely sentinel. I was planning to go shopping for one this weekend. Any recommendations? Linda's smile returned, but this time it seemed more genuine. Oh, I'd be happy to help. There are very specific requirements, height, materials, colors. It can be overwhelming for someone who's not familiar with the standards. That would be great, David said, though something in his gut told him to be careful. I want to make sure I get it right the first time. Smart man, Linda said, patting his arm in a way that felt more condescending than friendly. I tell everyone the same thing. It's so much easier to do things correctly from the start than to have to make changes later. The mail carrier had reached their section of the street and was approaching David's empty post. The young man looked confused for a moment, then shrugged and continued to the next house. Poor mailman, Linda said, shaking her head. He's probably wondering where your mailbox went. The Postal Service can be very picky about their delivery requirements, too. David made a mental note to prioritize the mailbox shopping. The last thing he wanted was to start off on the wrong foot with anyone, the HOA, the Postal Service, or his new neighbors. Well, I should probably head back, he said, holding up the binder. I've got movers coming soon, and I want to review these guidelines before they start unloading. Of course, Linda said. And David? If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask. I've been in this neighborhood for 12 years and I know all the ins and outs. I'm always happy to help new residents understand how things work around here. As David walked back toward his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's offer of help came with strings attached. There was something about the way she'd emphasized certain words. Standards. Appropriate. Understand how things work. That made him wonder if her helpfulness was really as innocent as it seemed. He unlocked his front door and stepped inside, his empty house. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. This was his sanctuary, his reward for years of hard work and determination. Whatever quirks his neighbors might have, he wasn't going to let them dim his excitement about this new chapter in his life. David opened the blue binder and started reading. The guidelines were incredibly detailed, covering everything from the exact shade of white allowed for trim paint to the specific breeds of dogs that were considered appropriate for the neighborhood. As he read, he began to understand why Linda had seemed so intense about the rules. This wasn't just an HOA, it was more like a small government with very strong opinions about how people should live their lives. Still, he'd known what he was getting into when he bought in a planned community. Rules were the price of living somewhere nice and well-maintained. As long as he followed them, everything would be fine. 3 weeks had passed since David moved into his new home, and he was finally starting to feel settled. The boxes were unpacked, his furniture was arranged just the way he liked it, and he'd even managed to plant some flowers in the front yard. Most importantly, he'd bought and installed a beautiful black metal mailbox that met every single specification in Linda's thick rule book. He'd spent hours at the hardware store, measuring and comparing different models to make sure he got it exactly right. The mailbox was regulation height, painted the approved matte black color, and positioned precisely 18 inches from the curb edge, just like the guidelines required. David had even bought a small level to make sure it was perfectly straight. That first Monday morning after installing his mailbox, David felt a sense of pride as he watched the postal worker fill it with his mail. Finally, everything was official. He was truly a resident of Oakwood Heights. But his satisfaction didn't last long. On Wednesday morning, David walked outside to get his mail and stopped dead in his tracks. His mailbox was tilted at a weird angle, leaning so far to one side it looked like it might fall over completely. The post was still in the ground, but something had clearly hit it hard enough to knock it askew. David examined the damage more closely. There were no obvious tire marks or signs of what might have caused it. Maybe a delivery truck had clipped it, or perhaps the ground had shifted during the recent rainstorm. These things happened, especially with new installations. He spent his lunch break that day, straightening the mailbox and reinforcing the post with some extra concrete. It was annoying, but not worth making a big deal about. 2 weeks later, David discovered the post had been loosened again, This time, the entire mailbox was wobbling when the wind blew. Someone or something had definitely been messing with it, because the concrete around the base was disturbed and there were fresh tool marks on the metal post. David was starting to get frustrated. He'd put a lot of effort into choosing and installing that mailbox correctly, and now he was having to fix it every few weeks. He decided to keep a closer eye on things and maybe ask around the neighborhood to see if anyone had noticed anything suspicious. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning when David couldn't sleep and decided to get up early to work in his garden. At exactly 6:15 a.m., as he was watering his newly planted roses, he heard the distinct sound of squeaking bicycle brakes, followed by a metallic clang. David quietly walked to the corner of his house and peered around the side. What he saw made his blood boil. A teenage boy, probably around 16 or 17, was riding his bike in slow circles around David's mailbox. The kid would pedal up close, then deliberately swing his back wheel into the post before riding away a few feet and coming back for another hit. He was clearly trying to loosen it without making too much noise. The boy looked familiar, and after a moment, David realized why. It was Linda's son. He'd seen the kid mowing her lawn a few weeks earlier. The same woman who'd been so concerned about neighborhood standards was apparently teaching her own child to vandalize other people's property. David pulled out his phone and started recording. The video clearly showed the boy's face and his deliberate actions. After about 5 minutes of this bizarre behavior, the teenager seemed satisfied with the damage he'd caused and rode off toward Linda's house. David was furious, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had evidence now, and he was going to handle this the right way. After breakfast, he walked over to Linda's house and rang her doorbell. Linda answered the door wearing a flowery bathrobe and holding a cup of coffee. Her friendly smile appeared instantly, but David noticed it seemed a bit more strained than usual. "David, what a nice surprise. How are you settling in?" "I'm doing well, thanks," David replied, keeping his voice steady. "But I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been having some problems with my mailbox getting damaged, and this morning I caught someone on camera messing with it." Linda's eyebrows shot up in apparent surprise. "Oh my goodness, how terrible. Do you know who it was?" David pulled out his phone and showed her the video. "Actually, I think it might be someone you know." Linda watched the footage, and David could see the exact moment she recognized her son. Her face went through several expressions: surprise, embarrassment, anger, and then something that looked almost like defiance. "Well," she said after a long pause, "boys will be boys, you know. Kids do silly things sometimes. I'm sure he didn't mean any real harm." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Linda, he was deliberately trying to damage my mailbox. This isn't just kids being kids. This is vandalism." Linda's friendly mask started to slip. "Look, David, I think you might be overreacting a bit. Maybe your mailbox installation wasn't as solid as you thought. These things happen in new construction sometimes." "The mailbox was installed correctly," David said firmly. "I followed every guideline in that binder you gave me, and this video clearly shows your son intentionally hitting it with his bike." Linda sighed and shook her head. "You know, I've been thinking about your mailbox situation anyway. I hate to say this, but some of the other neighbors have mentioned that it seems a bit provocative." "Provocative?" David repeated, genuinely confused. "It's a standard black mailbox that meets all the HOA requirements." "Well, yes, technically it meets the requirements," Linda said, her tone becoming more condescending. "But sometimes there are unwritten rules about what really fits in with the neighborhood character. Your mailbox is quite large and bold, and it does draw attention." David felt like he was in some kind of alternate reality. "Linda, it's identical to at least 6 other mailboxes on the street alone. Mrs. Peterson, 3 houses down, has the exact same model." "That's different," Linda said quickly. "Mrs. Peterson has been here for years. She's established. When new residents come in and immediately make bold choices, it can be disruptive to the community harmony." The meaning behind her words was becoming crystal clear, and David felt his anger rising. This wasn't about his mailbox at all. This was about him, and Linda's apparent belief that he didn't belong in her neighborhood. "So what exactly are you Suggesting? David asked. Linda brightened up as if she'd been hoping he would ask. Well, there are some lovely smaller mailbox options that might be more appropriate for a new resident. Something that blends in better while you're getting established in the community. David looked at Linda for a long moment, trying to process the absurdity of what she was suggesting. His mailbox was causing problems because it was too bold for a new resident. But somehow the identical mailboxes owned by longtime neighbors were perfectly fine. Linda, I'm not changing my mailbox. It follows every single rule in the HOA guidelines, and I installed it correctly. Your son damaged it, and I'd appreciate it if you'd talk to him about respecting other people's property. Linda's fake smile disappeared completely. David, I think you're being unreasonable. I'm trying to help you understand how things work around here, but you seem determined to make waves. I'm not trying to make waves, David replied. I'm just trying to live in my house and receive my mail like everyone else. Well, Linda said, her voice turning cold, I suppose we'll just have to agree to disagree. But I do hope you'll reconsider your approach. Community harmony is so important, and it would be such a shame if new residents felt unwelcome because they couldn't adapt to our neighborhood culture. With that thinly veiled threat, Linda closed her door, leaving David standing on her porch, feeling like he'd just stepped into some kind of nightmare. He walked back to his house, his mind racing with questions and concerns. Over the next few days, David started paying more attention to his surroundings. He noticed that Linda seemed to walk her small white dog past his house multiple times per day, always slowing down to stare at his mailbox. He also realized that several other neighbors had been giving him odd looks lately, though he couldn't tell if they were unfriendly or just curious. Most disturbing of all, David discovered that his mailbox had been vandalized again, this time with some ugly scratches on the side that looked intentional. But when he checked his security footage, he didn't see anything obvious. Whoever was doing this was getting more careful about not being caught. The next 2 months turned into a living nightmare for David. What started as a simple mailbox issue had somehow spiraled into an all-out war that he never saw coming. Linda wasn't just upset about his mailbox anymore. She had turned into a one-woman enforcement army with David as her primary target. It began with the first official HOA complaint letter that arrived in his perfectly regulation mailbox on a Tuesday morning. David opened the envelope, expecting maybe a welcome packet or community newsletter. Instead, he found a formal notice claiming his mailbox was an eyesore and not in keeping with community aesthetic standards. David read the letter 3 times, convinced there had been some mistake. The complaint described his mailbox as oversized, attention-seeking, and disruptive to neighborhood harmony. It demanded he replace it within 30 days or face escalating fines. He walked outside and stared at his mailbox, then looked at the identical ones belonging to the Johnson family 2 houses down and the elderly couple across the street. They were literally the same model, same color, same everything, yet somehow only his was considered problematic. David decided to attend the next HOA meeting to clear up what he assumed was a misunderstanding. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. About 20 residents were scattered around folding chairs, most of them looking bored as Linda read through various administrative items. When David's mailbox complaint came up on the agenda, he raised his hand to speak. Linda acknowledged him with a tight smile. I'd like to address this complaint about my mailbox, David said, standing up. I believe there's been an error. My mailbox meets all the specifications outlined in the HOA guidelines. A few residents turned to look at him with mild interest. Linda shuffled through some papers on her table. Mr. Thompson, she said, using his last name for the first time since they'd met. The complaint isn't about technical specifications. It's about overall aesthetic impact on the community. But what makes my mailbox different from the others? On the street? David asked. The Johnsons have the exact same model. Linda's expression hardened. The Johnsons have been valued members of this community for 8 years. They've earned the trust and respect of their neighbors through consistent demonstration of community values. David felt like he was losing his mind. Are you saying that the same mailbox is acceptable for some residents but not others based on how long they've lived here? A murmur went through the small crowd. A few people looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up to support David. "What I'm saying," Linda replied, her voice taking on a condescending tone, "is that new residents need to understand that being part of this community is about more than just following the letter of the law. It's about showing respect for established neighborhood culture and demonstrating that you're here to fit in, not stand out." David looked around the room, hoping someone would point out how ridiculous this sounded. Instead, he saw a mix of blank stares and a few sympathetic looks from people who seemed afraid to speak up. "I'm not trying to stand out," David said. "I just want to receive my mail like everyone else." Linda smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Of course you do. And I'm sure, once you find a more appropriate mailbox option, this whole issue will be resolved." The meeting moved on to other topics, leaving David feeling frustrated and confused. As residents filed out afterward, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached him. "I'm Janet," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure Linda wasn't watching. "I live on Maple Street on the other side of the neighborhood." "Nice to meet you," David replied. Janet leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but you're not the first person Linda has targeted. She did the same thing to the Martinez family when they moved in last year, complained about their garden, their car, even their porch light. They ended up moving away after 6 months. David's heart sank. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Janet said. "And before that, it was Dr. Chen. Same pattern. Constant complaints, harassment, making life miserable until people give up and leave. The thing is, she's very careful about how she does it. She makes it look like she's just enforcing community standards. Why doesn't anyone stop her?" Janet sighed. "Because she's been here the longest and she's managed to surround herself with people who either agree with her or are too scared to speak up. Plus, she knows all the rules inside and out. She's very good at using the system against people." David felt a chill run down his spine. "So what you're telling me is that she's going to keep harassing me until I move away?" "I hope not," Janet said. "But I wanted you to know what you're dealing with. Document everything, and don't let her intimidate you. Some of us are rooting for you, even if we can't say so publicly." Over the next few weeks, David began to understand what Janet meant. The complaints started coming regularly, sometimes twice a week. Linda found fault with everything. His lawn was cut too short, then too long. His garbage cans were placed improperly. His porch light was too bright. His car was parked at the wrong angle in his own driveway. Each complaint came with official letterhead and formal language, making them look legitimate even when they were completely ridiculous. David started taking photos of everything: his lawn, his garbage placement, his car position, just to prove he was following the rules. The stress was getting to him. He found himself checking his mailbox nervously each day, dreading what new complaint might be waiting. His coworkers started commenting that he seemed distracted and he was having trouble sleeping. Things got worse when Linda began recruiting allies. David noticed that certain neighbors had started giving him unfriendly looks. Mrs. Patterson from down the street, who had always waved politely before, now turned away when she saw him. The retired man who lived next door to Linda began making loud comments about people who don't respect community standards whenever David was in his yard. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when David discovered something that made his blood run cold. He walked outside to water his plants and found ugly words spray-painted on the side of his mailbox. The graffiti was clearly meant to be hurtful and offensive, targeting David's race in the most vicious way possible. David stood there staring at the hateful message, feeling sick to his stomach. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. Someone in his neighborhood hated him enough to vandalize his property with racist slurs. He immediately called the police and filed a report. The officer who responded was professional and took photos of the damage, but David could tell that the cop didn't expect much to come of the investigation. "Happens more than you'd think," the officer said sadly. "Usually it's teenagers pulling pranks, but sometimes it's adults who should know better. Either way, it's hard to prove who did it unless you catch them in the act." David spent the rest of the day scrubbing the paint off his mailbox, but the words had been etched into his mind. He kept looking around the neighborhood, wondering which of his neighbors might be responsible. Was it Linda, her son, one of her supporters? The most disturbing part was what happened next. On Monday morning, David found Linda walking her dog past his house, moving slower than usual and staring directly at his mailbox. When she saw him watching from his window, she didn't look away or seem embarrassed. Instead, she gave him a small wave and continued her walk as if nothing had happened. Later that day, David ran into her at the grocery store. Linda approached him with her usual fake smile. "David, I heard about the unfortunate incident with your mailbox over the weekend. How terrible that some troublemaker would do such a thing." The way she said it made David's skin crawl. Her tone was sympathetic, but her eyes looked almost pleased. "Yes, it was pretty shocking," David replied carefully. "I do hope it doesn't happen again," Linda said. "Sometimes these incidents are isolated, but other times they can be a sign that someone is attracting the wrong kind of attention. You might want to consider whether there's anything about your property that's drawing unwanted notice." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. Linda was actually suggesting that the racist vandalism was somehow his fault for having an attention-getting mailbox. David realized he was dealing with something much worse than a pushy neighbor. Linda wasn't just trying to control his landscaping choices. She was systematically trying to make his life so miserable that he would give up and move away. And the worst part was that she was doing it all while maintaining the appearance of being a concerned community leader, just trying to uphold neighborhood standards. David had reached his breaking point. After months of harassment, bogus complaints, and racist vandalism, he knew he had two choices: give up and move away, like Linda wanted, or fight back smart. Running away wasn't an option. He'd worked too hard to get this house, and he wasn't about to let a bully drive him out of his own home. But David also knew that going head-to-head with Linda using her own tactics wouldn't work. She had years of experience manipulating the HOA system, plus a network of supporters who either agreed with her or were too intimidated to oppose her. He needed a different approach, something she wouldn't see coming. The idea came to him during lunch with his college buddy Mike, who worked as a paralegal at a downtown law firm. David had been venting about his situation when Mike interrupted him. "Wait, hold up," Mike said, leaning forward. "You're telling me this woman has been filing fake complaints against you for months and nobody's bothered to check whether she's actually following the rules herself?" David paused, a French fry halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people like this are usually hypocrites," Mike explained. "They're so busy pointing fingers at everyone else that they forget to look in the mirror. When was the last time anyone actually inspected her property to make sure she's not violating any rules?" That conversation planted a seed in David's mind. That evening, he dug out the thick blue binder Linda had given him on his first day in the neighborhood. He'd read through it before, but this time he approached it differently. Instead of just checking what he needed to do, he started looking for things that Linda might be doing wrong. The guidelines were incredibly detailed, covering everything from the exact height of fences to the types of plants allowed in front yards. As David read through each section, he began making a list of things to check around Linda's property. The next morning, David took what he called a casual stroll through the neighborhood. He started 3 streets away and worked his way back toward his own house, taking careful note of how different properties looked. When he finally reached Linda's house, he stopped and pretended to check his phone while actually observing her yard. What he saw made him smile for the first time in weeks. Linda's fence was definitely taller than the regulation 4 feet. It looked closer to 5 feet in some sections. Her garden shed was painted bright yellow, which wasn't on the approved color list that specified only earth tones for outbuildings. Most interesting of all, her mailbox was a cheerful pink color that definitely wasn't in the guidelines. David couldn't believe he'd never noticed the pink mailbox before. It was right there at the end of her driveway, bold as anything. According to the rules he'd memorized, mailboxes were only allowed to be black, dark green, dark brown, or white. Pink wasn't even close to acceptable. But David didn't stop there. Over the next few days, he became a detective in his own neighborhood. He researched the HOA records at the county office and discovered some very interesting information. Linda's fence had been installed 3 years ago, but there was no permit on file for it. Her garden shed had been built 2 years ago, also without proper approval, and her pink mailbox had never been submitted for HOA review, which was required. for all new installations. The more David dug, the more violations he found. Linda had been breaking rules left and right while harassing other people for the tiniest infractions. She had an unauthorized decorative fountain in her front yard, landscaping that extended beyond the approved boundaries, and even a small deck, addition that had never been properly permitted. David's research also revealed something else interesting. He looked up the voting records from HOA board elections over the past few years and discovered that Linda had essentially appointed herself as the neighborhood enforcer. She wasn't even officially elected. She'd volunteered for the position, and nobody had bothered to oppose her. Armed with this information, David started phase 2 of his plan. He began documenting everything with photos and measurements. He researched the exact specifications for every violation he'd found and compared them to what Linda had installed on her property. But David's real breakthrough came when he was researching local ordinances at the city planning office. A friendly clerk mentioned that there had been some recent changes to mailbox safety requirements, particularly for corner properties like Linda's. "Oh yes," the clerk said, pulling out a thick manual. "The new regulations require mailboxes on corner lots to meet specific visibility and safety standards. They have to be a certain distance from the intersection and can't obstruct sight lines for drivers." David looked at the requirements and felt his heart racing. Linda's decorative pink mailbox, with its fancy curved post and ornamental plants around the base, violated at least 3 different safety codes. It was too close to the corner, too tall for the sightline requirements, and the surrounding landscaping created a visual obstruction. "What happens if someone's mailbox doesn't meet these requirements?" David asked. "Well, typically the city sends a notice asking for compliance within 30 days, the clerk explained. If the owner doesn't fix the problem, they can face fines. And eventually the city can remove the mailbox themselves." David left the planning office with a folder full of documentation and a plan that was starting to take shape. But he wasn't ready to make his move yet. He wanted to make sure he had everything perfect before he struck back. The next phase of his research took him to the neighborhood itself. David started paying attention to other residents who had been harassed by Linda. He remembered Janet mentioning the Martinez family and Dr. Chen. He also noticed that there were several other families in the neighborhood who seemed to keep to themselves and avoid Linda whenever possible. David decided to reach out to some of these people. He started with Janet, who had been kind enough to warn him about Linda's pattern of behavior. "I've been doing some research," David told Janet when he called her. "I think Linda might be breaking quite a few rules herself. Would you be interested in hearing about what I found?" Janet was definitely interested. She came over that evening and David showed her his documentation. Her eyes grew wider as she looked through the photos and measurements. "This is incredible," she said. "She's been terrorizing people for years over tiny infractions, and she's been breaking major rules the whole time. The question is, what should we do about it?" David asked. Janet was quiet for a moment, then looked up with a determined expression. "I think it's time Linda got a taste of her own medicine, but we need to be smart about this. She's going to fight back hard when she realizes what's happening." David and Janet spent the next hour planning their approach. They decided to start with the most obvious violations and work their way up to the bigger issues. They also agreed to involve other neighbors who had been affected by Linda's harassment. Over the next week, David quietly reached out to 3 other families who had been targeted by Linda. All of them were eager to help, and each one had their own stories of ridiculous complaints and harassment. Together, they formed an informal alliance dedicated to holding Linda accountable for her own rule violations. The group decided that David would file the first official complaint, since he had done most of the research and had the best documentation. They would start with Linda's unauthorized fence height, which was clear-cut and easy to prove. David spent an entire weekend preparing his complaint letter. He followed the exact same format that Linda had been using against him, complete with official language and detailed measurements. He included photographs taken from multiple angles and referenced the specific sections of the HOA guidelines that Linda was violating. When he finished, David had a document that was just as thorough and professional as anything Linda had ever filed. The difference was that his complaint was based on actual rule violations, not made-up aesthetic concerns. David hand-delivered the complaint to the HOA management office on a Monday morning. The receptionist accepted it with the same bored efficiency she probably used for all such complaints. David wondered if Linda had any idea what was coming her way. The real test would be seeing how Linda reacted when she received her first taste of her own medicine. David had a feeling that someone who had spent years dishing out harassment wasn't going to take it very well when the tables were turned.